I'm reading from Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 5 through 7. God speaking to Habakkuk. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days, which you would not believe, though it were told you. For indeed, I am raising up the Chaldeans. On Sunday, we read this passage from the Old Testament book of Habakkuk, in which God revealed his plan of discipline for the rebellious and immoral people of Judah, his people. His people had turned their backs on him, choosing to pursue pleasure and, sin. You may remember that his plan was to raise up the Chaldeans, often referred to as the Babylonians, a wicked, wicked nation, and a powerful one. Understandably, Habakkuk was disappointed. This was the divine plan? The people of Judah have turned to sin, but the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, are even worse. Clearly, if Habakkuk was in charge, he would have done things differently. Do you ever wish that we were in charge in our circumstances today? Do you ever wish that we could put things right the way that we want to put things right? If we were in charge, what would you do? Right. I know what some of you are thinking. But remember, one of the most important lessons that we mined from our study last Sunday was the reminder that we apparently need from time to time. God's ways are not our ways. He knows our circumstances, and we can trust him as we live by faith. He will bring us to victory in his time and in his way. As I read this part of the book of Habakkuk, my mind is taken to another place in Scripture where a man and woman took things in their own hands as if they were in charge and chose to do things their way rather than God's way. It's a time and place when it didn't turn out well. And interestingly, there's a connection between these two stories. That connection is the Chaldeans. In the early stages of God's plan to rescue mankind, all the way back in the book of Genesis, he called Abram, who would become Abraham. He gave Abram two dramatic words of instruction. First, he told Abram that he and his wife Sarai would have a son, and through that son he would have many, many descendants. And second, he called Abram to leave his homeland and go to what we refer to as the Promised Land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Like Habakkuk, years later, Abram was skeptical of God's plan because, he was almost 100 years old, and Sarai was well past childbearing age. Don't you know they thought, really? Lord, this is your plan? The Bible tells us that Sarai laughed out loud at God's plan. So she and Abram took things into their own hands with this very clever idea to let Hagar, the Egyptian maidservant, bear the promised child instead of Sarai. Along comes Ishmael. And God is not particularly pleased that Abram and Sarai didn't obey his plan. Well, some years later, Abram, now Abraham, and Sarai, now Sarah, had a son, Isaac. As time went on, the two boys didn't get along very well. Sarah and Hagar didn't get along. So this family, the result of doing things my way, The family split up, Hagar and Ishmael going their own way. The end result of that lack of faith was the beginning of the Arab nation. We know how well that turned out. Oh, and the homeland that Abraham was asked to leave? Abraham's home was the city of Ur of the Chaldeans, likely present-day Iraq. So fast forward to Habakkuk's day, and here again we find the Chaldeans. This time, God is raising up these former neighbors, maybe even cousins, to take his people, the people of Judah, captive because of their sin and disobedience. Like Abram and Sarai, Habakkuk had a hard time trusting God's plan. Maybe you and I do too, in the circumstances that we face today. Or maybe in our day, we believers will finally learn to accept what Abram and Habakkuk both found hard to grasp. God's ways are not our ways.